When the man who is about to marry your daughter looks right through you every single morning like you're part of the upholstery, you learn a lot about his soul. I'm Darlene Vance, 54, a former title clerk from Akron, Ohio, and this is how I used his absolute blindness to dismantle his perfect, cruel little world. If you've ever had your life's work handed back to you in a cardboard box after 22 years of loyal service, you know the hollow feeling in your chest. When Buckeye Land and Title downsized, they didn't care that I knew every easement, property line, and deed restriction in Summit County by heart. They just saw a line item they could delete. But a mother doesn't have the luxury of sitting around and feeling sorry for herself. I had a mortgage on our modest, split-level home, and more importantly, I had Chloe. Chloe is my 24-year-old daughter. She's a preschool teacher who smells like finger paint and lavender soap, with a heart so soft she still cries when she sees a dead bird on the sidewalk. She is the kind of girl who believes everyone is inherently good. When she met Julian Vance, no relation, though he certainly acted like he owned the name and the town, she thought she'd found her prince. Julian was an associate portfolio manager at a private wealth firm in downtown Cleveland. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment and drove a leased German sports car that he refused to park in the winter slush. That's where I came in. To keep us afloat and ensure Chloe didn't have to worry about helping me with bills, I started driving for Elite Commute, a premium, private black car service that caters to the wealthy executives commuting from the West Akron suburbs up to the city. I drove a clean, well-maintained black Chevy Traverse. I bought it used, kept it immaculate, and hung a small pine-scented air freshener from the rearview mirror. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., I'd pull up to the soaring glass tower of the luxury apartment complex where Julian lived. And every morning, he would slide into the back seat, smelling of expensive sandalwood cologne and mints, without ever looking at my face. To him, I wasn't Darlene, his future mother-in-law. I wasn't even a human being. I was just the silent silhouette in the driver's seat. I wore a dark baseball cap pulled low, a simple black coat, and a pair of worn leather driving gloves with a tiny tear on the right index finger. I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth shut. Chloe had told him her mother did some consulting and driving work, but Julian had never bothered to ask for a photo, let alone meet me. "We'll do a big family dinner once the merger at my firm goes through, babe," he'd tell Chloe, his voice dripping with condescension whenever she brought it up. Right now, my schedule is just too elite. Have you ever been completely invisible to someone who thinks they own the world? It's a cold kind of freedom, let me tell you. I watched him in my rearview mirror. He would swipe through his tablet, bark orders at his subordinates over his phone, and groom his perfect thick hair. My sister, Sarah, who has been my rock through my divorce and the subsequent hard years, sat at my worn kitchen table one evening, watching me wrap my hands around a dented green Stanley thermos. "Darlene, you can't keep doing this," Sarah said, her eyes welling with tears as she watched me massage my aching lower back. "You're driving 12 hours a day, and that boy is treating you like hired help." If Chloe knew— "Chloe can't know," I interrupted gently, taking a slow sip of my strong chicory coffee. "She's happy, Sarah. She thinks she's building a life with a man who loves her. If she knew I was driving her fiancé to work every morning just to pay our property taxes, she'd call off the wedding and try to get a second job. She deserves her fairy tale. I can handle a little driving. But a mother's instinct is a funny thing. It whispers to you when something is rotten, long before you see the mold. It was a bitter, gray Tuesday morning in mid-November. The Ohio sky looked like dirty dishwater, and a nasty mix of sleet and road salt was splattering against my windshield. The heater in the Traverse was humming, blowing a dry warmth that smelled faintly of the cinnamon pine cone I'd placed in the door pocket. Julian climbed into the back seat at 6:15 a.m. sharp. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost a semester of Chloe's college tuition. He didn't say good morning. He just tapped the back of my headrest with 2 fingers, his universal signal for go. I shifted into drive and merged onto Route 18, heading toward the highway. A few minutes into the drive, Julian's phone buzzed. He picked it up on the speaker setting, his voice loud and clear over the hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. "Hey, Mom," Julian said, his tone instantly shifting from his usual arrogant bark to something slick and greasy. On the other end of the line was Victoria, his mother, I had never met her, but Chloe had described her as a woman who values presentation above all else. Victoria ran a high-end home staging business in Shaker Heights and treated my daughter like a charity project. "Julian, darling," Victoria's voice crackled through the car's quiet cabin. "Have you spoken to the lawyer about the Bath Township property? We need to have those documents finalized before the rehearsal dinner next month. I won't have that girl's family dragging down our estate planning." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The leather of my gloves creaked in the silence. The Bath Township property. My late father, a hard-working carpenter who built half the homes in our neighborhood, had left Chloe a 3-acre parcel of prime, undeveloped land near the new commercial district in Bath. It was her inheritance, her safety net. I had transferred the deed into her name on her 21st birthday, using my decades of title experience to ensure it was clean, clear, and entirely hers. It was worth at least $150,000 today, completely free of any liens. "It's already taken care of, Mom," Julian chuckled, a dry, mocking sound that made my stomach turn. I had the legal team draft a standard asset contribution agreement under the guise of our joint LLC. Chloe thinks we're putting the land into a trust to build our future dream home on it. She's so incredibly naive. She signed the preliminary transfer papers last night without even reading the fine print. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "And the prenuptial agreement?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp as glass. "Fully customized," Julian replied smoothly. "Once she signs the final deed transfer to the LLC next week, the land becomes a business asset of Vance Holdings. The prenup states that in the event of a dissolution of marriage, any assets held under the LLC remain solely with the managing partner, which is me. She won't have a single legal claim to her grandfather's land or the appreciation value. I'm leveraging that property next month for a commercial development loan to buy my partnership stake at the firm. And she has no idea?" Victoria sounded almost amused. "Mom, please," Julian scoffed, rustling some papers in his briefcase. "Chloe doesn't know a lien from a loophole. I told her it was for tax shelter purposes, and she just smiled, kissed my cheek, and said she trusted me. She's lucky she's pretty, because she certainly isn't smart. Her mother is just some retired office worker who drives a cab or something. They don't have the money to hire a real lawyer to review this. Once the wedding is over and the deed is filed, the land is mine. If she ever steps out of line, or if I get tired of her playing house, I can walk away with everything, and she'll be right back in her mother's split level with nothing but her preschool teaching certificate." The sleet was hitting the windshield harder now, a steady, aggressive tapping. I looked up at the rearview mirror. Julian was smiling, staring out the side window at the passing gray trees, completely satisfied with his own cleverness. He had no idea that the silent woman in the front seat, the one he had just dismissed as a retired office worker, was a woman who had spent 22 years analyzing fraudulent deed transfers, dissecting predatory contracts, and protecting honest people from snakes, exactly like him. He thought he was playing a game with an easy target. He didn't know he had just handed the rulebook to the referee. I took a deep, steadying breath, my chest rising and falling beneath my dark coat. I didn't say a word. I didn't gasp. I didn't pull the car over. I just adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, my mind instantly shifting from a mother's heartbreak to a title clerk's cold, calculating precision. He wanted to play with deeds, trusts, and LLCs. He wanted to use my daughter's trust as a stepping stone for his own greed. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 6:42 a.m. By the time I dropped him off at his high-rise office, I would have the entire legal framework of my response mapped out in my head. Julian Vance thought he was invisible to the consequences of his cruelty, but he was about to find out that some people see everything. I pulled the Chevy Traverse up to the glittering curb of the glass tower on East 9th Street in Cleveland. Julian got out, adjusted his charcoal wool coat with a sharp, arrogant flick of his wrists, and slammed the door without a backward glance. He walked through the revolving doors like he owned the air he breathed. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the cheap black vinyl groaned. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a steel band around my ribs and was slowly turning the crank. I drove to a quiet, half-empty parking lot near the lakefront, pulled into a space facing the gray, churning waters of Lake Erie, and finally let the tears come. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever had to look at your own child, the baby you rocked to sleep when the fever was high, the girl you worked double shifts for just so she could have decent shoes for school, and realize that a predator is standing right next to her, smiling, while he slowly tightens a noose around her future? If you've ever felt that cold, paralyzing terror mix with a sudden, burning rage, then you know exactly what was happening in my chest. I wanted to drive straight to Chloe's school, pull her out of her classroom, and scream the truth at her. I wanted to drive to Julian's fancy high-rise and throw his expensive leather briefcase into the muddy lake. But a title clerk knows that anger is messy. Anger leaves footprints. Anger makes you sloppy. And when you're dealing with a man who has a team of corporate lawyers on retainer, you cannot afford to be sloppy. Paperwork, on the other hand, is clean. Paperwork doesn't yell. It doesn't lose its temper. It just sits there, waiting for the right hand to turn the page and expose the rot underneath. I wiped my face with a cheap paper napkin from the glove compartment, shifted the car into drive, and headed back to Akron. I had work to do. When I got back to my modest, split-level home, the quietness of the house welcomed me like an old friend. The scent of the cinnamon pine cone in the hallway was a stark contrast to the sterile, expensive sandalwood cologne that still lingered in the back seat of my car. I walked down the narrow basement stairs to my small corner workspace. This was the place where I had spent 22 years studying easement maps, property disputes, and municipal tax codes. On the corner of my cluttered desk sat my most prized professional possession, a heavy, worn brass magnifying glass with a cracked cherrywood handle. It was a retirement gift from an old county surveyor named Harold, who had taught me how to read metes and bounds back in the 90s. That magnifying glass had helped me catch forged signatures, fraudulent notary stamps, and hidden liens on thousands of properties across Summit County. It was my shield and my sword. I picked it up, feeling the cool, solid weight of the brass in my palm. My sister Sarah arrived 30 minutes later. She didn't even knock. She just let herself in, carrying a plastic container of leftover beef stew and a loaf of crusty bread. She took one look at my face and set the food down on the worn kitchen table. "Darlene," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What happened? Did that boy say something to you?" "He didn't say anything to me, Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because to him, I don't exist. But I heard him. I heard him talking to his mother on the phone." I sat Sarah down at the table and told her everything. I told her about the Bath Township property, the 3 acres of prime land my father had worked his fingers to the bone to leave for Chloe. I told her about the joint LLC, the customized pre-nuptial agreement, and Julian's plan to strip Chloe of her inheritance to fund his own partnership stake at his firm. As I spoke, Sarah's eyes welled with tears. She grabbed my hand, her fingers trembling. "Oh, Darlene. No, not Papa's land. Chloe loves that place. She talks about building a little house there one day. How could he do this? We have to tell her. We have to tell her right now." "No," I said, gently but firmly, squeezing her hand. "If we just tell her, Julian will spin it. He's slick, Sarah. He'll tell her I'm a bitter, jealous old woman who can't stand to see her happy. He'll convince her that I'm trying to control her life, and she'll sign those papers even faster just to prove her loyalty to him. We need the documents first. I need to see exactly what he's putting in front of her." That evening, I drove over to Chloe's small apartment under the pretense of bringing her some fresh vegetable soup. When she opened the door, she looked exhausted but happy. The living room floor was covered in wedding magazines, fabric swatches for bridesmaid dresses, and stacks of cream-colored invitation envelopes. "Mom!" she gasped, wrapping her arms around my neck. She smelled like lavender soap and school glue. "You shouldn't have driven all this way, but oh, the soup smells amazing." "I just wanted to check on my girl," I said, kissing her cheek. I walked into the kitchen and set the container on the counter. Right there, next to the toaster, was a thick blue vinyl binder with the words "Wedding Planning and Legal" written on the spine in Chloe's neat, round handwriting. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. "Julian says we have to get all our ducks in a row before the rehearsal dinner next month," Chloe said, pouring some soup into a mug. He's been so helpful with the financial stuff, Mom. He had his lawyers draft some papers to protect Papa's land. He says putting it into a joint trust will protect us from tax liability when we build our house. I kept my voice light, casual. Oh, really? That's very forward-thinking of him. You know how I am with contracts, sweetie. 20 years of looking at deeds makes it hard to turn off the brain. Mind if I take a quick peek at what his lawyers drafted? Just to make sure they got the legal description of the parcel right. Chloe smiled, completely devoid of suspicion. Of course, Mom. It's in the front pocket of the blue binder. Julian told me not to worry about the boring legal jargon, but he left a copy of the preliminary asset agreement there for me to sign. I pulled the document from the binder. My eyes scanned the title. Asset Contribution and Transfer Agreement for Vance Holdings, LLC. I'll just take this home and look it over tonight while I have my tea, I said, slipping the pages into my canvas tote bag. I'll bring it right back tomorrow. Thanks, Mom, Chloe said, coming over to give me another hug. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, baby, I whispered into her hair. When I got back to my kitchen table, the house was dead silent. I turned on the overhead yellow light, put on my reading glasses, and pulled out my brass magnifying glass. Sarah sat across from me, holding a cold cup of tea, watching me in absolute silence. For the next 3 hours, I dissected that agreement word by word, line by line. Julian's high-priced Shaker Heights lawyers had indeed drafted a masterpiece of predatory corporate law. The agreement stated that Chloe was transferring the full, unencumbered title of the Bath Township property to Vance Holdings, LLC, in exchange for a membership interest in the company. However, under Section 4, 2 of the operating agreement, hidden deep within the boilerplate text of page 14, that membership interest was non-voting and could be unilaterally liquidated by the managing partner in the event of a marital dissolution. The property itself, and any appreciation or development value, would remain the sole, undivided asset of the LLC. It was a legal theft, wrapped in the language of partnership. If Chloe signed the final deed transfer, she would lose her father's land the moment the ink dried on their marriage license. But as I moved my magnifying glass down to the signature blocks, my eyes caught something. A tiny, glaring error. Julian's lawyers had used a boilerplate template from their firm's main office in Delaware, but they had filed the preliminary paperwork under Ohio jurisdiction. In the state of Ohio, under Revised Code Section 1706-30, any asset contribution of real property to a limited liability company by a non-member requires a specific certification of authority signed by both parties and notarized prior to the execution of the preliminary transfer. Julian had been so eager to lock Chloe down, so arrogant in his belief that we were too poor and too stupid to notice, that he had Chloe sign the preliminary transfer agreement without executing the required Ohio statutory disclosures. But that wasn't the biggest mistake. I opened my old laptop, logged into the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Registry database, and typed in the name, Vance Holdings, LLC. Nothing. I tried variations. Nothing. I then searched the pending business filings for Summit and Cuyahoga counties. There it was. The filing for Vance Holdings, LLC had been submitted 3 weeks ago, but it was currently flagged with an active name conflict rejection. There was already an active registered corporation in Cleveland called Vance Holding Group. Julian's entity didn't legally exist yet. It was sitting in a state of administrative suspension. Julian Vance had forced my daughter to sign a contract transferring her grandfather's valuable land to a corporate entity that was nothing more than a ghost. I let out a long, slow breath. The cold air of the kitchen felt fresh against my skin. I looked up at Sarah, who was holding her breath, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Darlene?" she whispered. "Is it bad?" "It's worse than bad, Sarah," I said, a slow, quiet smile spreading across my face. "It's a fraud. And because he was too arrogant to check his own filings, he just handed me the keys to his entire financial future." The next morning, the weather in Northeast Ohio didn't offer any mercy. The sleet had stopped, but it was replaced by a biting, bone-chilling wind that swept off Lake Erie, turning the puddles on Route 18 into sheets of black ice. I sat in the driveway of my split-level home at 5:30 a.m., waiting for the Chevy Traverse's engine to warm up. The heater groaned, slowly pushing a dry, cinnamon-scented heat through the vents. I rubbed my hands together, my worn leather driving gloves creaking in the quiet cabin. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The dark baseball cap was pulled low, shadowing my eyes. I looked tired. I looked like a 54-year-old woman who had spent too many years worrying about mortgages, property taxes, and her daughter's happiness. But beneath that exhaustion, there was a cold, steady spark. If you've ever had to put on a mask and play a part while your heart is breaking, you know how heavy that silence can be. But you also know how powerful it makes you. When people think you are nobody, they don't bother to hide who they really are. At 6:15 a.m. sharp, I pulled up to the curb of Julian's luxury apartment building. He stepped out of the lobby, his charcoal wool coat open, his silk tie fluttering in the freezing wind. He climbed into the back seat, bringing the scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne and a gust of freezing air with him. He didn't say a word. He just tapped the back of my headrest twice with his knuckles. Go. I shifted into drive and merged into the morning traffic. 5 minutes into the commute, Julian's phone rang. He swiped the screen and put it on the speaker, resting the device on his knee. "Julian!" a man's voice boomed through the car's speakers. It was deep, polished, and carried the unmistakable authority of old money. "I'm looking over the preliminary portfolio for your partnership buy-in. We need the certified deed of transfer for the Bath Township property and the corporate operating agreement for Vance Holdings LLC on my desk by the end of the month. The credit committee won't approve the commercial development loan without that land secured as collateral. It's already handled, Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his voice instantly taking on that oily, eager-to-please tone he reserved for people he deemed important. "The preliminary transfer agreement is signed. My fiancé is signing the final deed transfer next Thursday morning, right before our rehearsal dinner. I'll have my legal team file it with the Summit County Recorder's Office immediately. You'll have the certified copies by Friday afternoon." "Excellent," Sterling replied. "And there are no title issues? No outstanding liens or family disputes on that parcel? We can't afford any delays. If this loan doesn't clear by the first of the month, the partnership interest goes to Miller." "No issues at all," Julian chuckled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "The land was left to her by her grandfather. The title is completely clean. Her family doesn't have the legal resource or the intelligence to contest anything we're doing. They're just glad she's marrying into a family with a real portfolio." "Good. Don't disappoint me, Julian. This partnership is yours to lose." The call disconnected. In the rearview mirror, I watched Julian lean back against the leather seat, a smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. He tapped his fingers against his leather briefcase, already celebrating a victory he hadn't won. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the steering wheel. My mind, however, was spinning with mathematical and legal precision. He was leveraging Chloe's land for a commercial development loan to buy his partnership stake. He was using her grandfather's hard work as his ticket into the high society boys' club. And he was doing it using a fraudulent corporate shell that didn't even legally exist. Now let me tell you something about the Ohio Secretary of State's corporate filing system. It's a beautifully rigid machine. When a business filing is rejected due to a name conflict, the applicant has exactly 30 days to submit a corrected filing or obtain a consent to use of name from the active entity. If they fail to do so, the name reservation expires, and the name becomes public domain, available to anyone with a computer and a $99 filing fee. Julian's lawyers had been sloppy. They had submitted the filing for Vance Holdings LLC, received the rejection notice because of the active Vance Holding Group in Cleveland, and failed to resolve it before the deadline. Because of their arrogance, the name reservation had expired at midnight on Tuesday. They thought they had time to fix it. They didn't think anyone was watching. But a former title clerk from Akron was watching. As soon as I dropped Julian off at his high-rise office, I drove straight to a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. I ordered a mug of black chicory coffee, sat in a vinyl booth that smelled of maple syrup and grease, and opened my old laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I logged into the Ohio Secretary of State's business portal. I typed in the name Vance Holdings LLC. The status was listed as available. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, triumphant beat. I pulled out my credit card, the one with the small limit I kept for emergencies, and entered the details. I filed the Articles of Organization for Vance Holdings, LLC. But I didn't list Julian as the statutory agent. I listed my sister, Sarah, at her modest suburban address. I drafted the operating agreement on the spot, using a standard ironclad template I had used hundreds of times during my years at the title company. I designated the sole managing member of Vance Holdings, LLC as the Chloe Vance Trust. And the sole trustee of that trust? Me, Darlene Vance. I pressed submit. The screen buffered for an agonizing 10 seconds before a green checkmark appeared. Filing accepted. Document number 2023-4892. For $99, I had just bought the legal identity of the company Julian was planning to use to steal my daughter's land. When Chloe signed the final deed transfer to Vance Holdings, LLC, she wouldn't be transferring her grandfather's property to Julian's secret asset-stripping shell. She would be transferring it to a legally binding entity owned entirely by a trust designed to protect her, an entity managed by her mother. But I wasn't done. The trap was set, but I had to make sure Julian walked right into it without looking down. That afternoon, I met Sarah at our local diner. The air in the booth was warm, steam rising from our thick ceramic mugs. I opened my worn leather folder and slid the printed corporate registration documents across the table. Sarah put on her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the state seal at the top of the page. As she realized what I had done, her jaw dropped. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "Darlene," she whispered, leaning over the table. You registered his company? Under my address?" "I registered the real company, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady. "Julian's lawyers drafted a deed transfer from Chloe to Vance Holdings, LLC. They assumed they would resolve the name conflict and own the entity. But they didn't. I own it. The state of Ohio recognizes our entity as the sole legal owner of that name. When Chloe signs that deed next week, she is legally transferring the land to us. Julian won't have a single legal claim to it. He won't be a member, he won't be a manager, and he won't be able to use it as collateral for his loan without my signature." Sarah let out a shaky breath, her fingers brushing the gold seal on the paper. "But Darlene, when he tries to file the deed, won't his lawyers realize the LLC is registered to us?" "They will," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "But they won't check until after the deed is signed and filed. Julian is too arrogant to double-check his administrative paperwork, and his lawyers are too comfortable. They'll file the deed, assume everything is fine, and present the transfer to the bank to clear the loan. By the time they realize they've transferred the land to an entity they don't control, the signature will be notarized, the deed will be recorded, and the loan will be in jeopardy." "And Chloe?" Sarah asked, her voice softening with concern. "How do we keep her from finding out before it's time?" "We play along," I said. "I'm going to return the preliminary papers to her tonight. I'll tell her everything looks perfect. I'll let her believe she's doing the right thing for her future. We have to keep her safe from his suspicion, Sarah. If Julian gets even a hint that we're on to him, he'll change the paperwork, or worse, he'll pressure her into signing something else." That evening, I walked up the steps to Chloe's apartment. When she opened the door, she was holding a hot glue gun, her hair tied back in a messy bun. The smell of lavender soap and warm cinnamon rolls filled the air. "Mom," she smiled, pulling me into a warm hug. "Did you look over the papers? Is everything okay?" I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out the blue vinyl binder, sliding the preliminary agreement back into the front pocket. I looked into my daughter's beautiful, innocent eyes, the eyes of my father, who had worked 60 hours a week in the freezing Ohio winters just to make sure we had a roof over our heads. "Everything is perfect, sweetie," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I reached up and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "The legal description of the land is exactly right. You go ahead and tell Julian that you're ready to sign the final deed next week, but do me one favor." Chloe tilted her head, her smile softening. "Anything, Mom. When he brings the final deed to the office next Thursday morning, don't sign it until I've had one last look at the notary block," I said gently. Sometimes these big corporate firms make typos on the county code, and I just want to make sure it's recorded properly. Can you do that for me? Of course, Mom, Chloe said, wrapping her arms around my waist. I trust you. I know you just want to make sure I'm safe. More than anything in this world, baby, I whispered, holding her tight. As I drove home that night through the dark, frozen streets of Akron, I felt the full weight of what I was doing. I was playing a dangerous game with a man who had money, power, and a team of high-priced lawyers on his side. I was risking my relationship with my daughter, knowing she might hate me for keeping her in the dark until the final moment. But as I looked at the worn leather steering wheel of my Traverse, at the tiny tear in the index finger of my driving glove, I knew I couldn't back down. Julian Vance thought he was a predator, and he thought we were the prey. He thought he could use our silence, our poverty, and our trust to build his empire. He didn't know that silence is where plans are made, that poverty makes you sharp, and that a mother's love is the most dangerous contract of all. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 9:45 p.m. In less than a week, the rehearsal dinner would begin, and Julian Vance would walk into the trap I had built for him, one signature at a time. The air on the 32nd floor of the Sterling Tower in downtown Cleveland didn't feel like real air. It was sterile, dry, and smelled of expensive floor wax and the faint, bitter scent of over-roasted espresso. Huge glass windows stretched from the floor to the ceiling, offering a panoramic view of Lake Erie, which looked like a sheet of dirty tin under the heavy November clouds. I stood in the reception area, smoothing down the front of my navy blue knit dress. It was the dress I'd bought on clearance at J.C. Penney 3 years ago for my cousin's wedding. It wasn't silk, and it certainly didn't have a designer label, but it was clean, pressed, and respectable. Pinning my mother's vintage silver leaf brooch near my collarbone felt like putting on a piece of armor. Beside me, my sister Sarah was holding a worn manila folder against her chest like a shield. Her knuckles were white, but her jaw was set. "Are you ready, Darlene?" she whispered, her voice trembling just a little. "I've spent 22 years preparing for a moment like this, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "I'm ready." If you've ever had to walk into a room full of people who think you are absolutely nothing, you know the strange, cold calm that settles over you. It's the peace of being completely underestimated. They don't see the storm coming because they don't think you're capable of making wind. The glass doors of the main conference room swung open, and a young receptionist in a tailored gray suit ushered us in. The room was vast. In the center sat a massive, cold slab of gray slate that served as a conference table, feeling more like a tombstone than a piece of furniture. Around it sat the players in this little drama. There was Mr. Sterling, the senior partner, looking every bit the old money patriarch with his silver hair and gold signet ring. Next to him was Victoria Vance, Julian's mother, wearing a cream-colored cashmere turtleneck and enough gold jewelry to anchor a small boat. She was typing furiously on her tablet, her face tight with impatience. And then there was Julian. He looked immaculate in a navy blue three-piece suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips. Chloe sat next to him. She looked so small in that giant leather chair. She was wearing a simple green sweater, her eyes bright but anxious, her hands folded tightly in her lap. In front of her lay the thick stack of legal documents, the final deed transfer for the Bath Township land. As Sarah and I walked in, Julian didn't even look up at first. He was busy adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Chloe, babe, we really need to get this signed," Julian said, his voice dripping with that patronizing warmth I had heard so many times through my rearview mirror. "Mr. Sterling's notary has a hard stop at 10:30, and my mother and I have to meet the florist at the country club." "I know, Julian," Chloe said softly, her voice wavering. "But I told you. My mom wanted to look at the notary block first. She's here." Julian finally raised his head. His eyes swept over me, starting from my sensible black loafers, up my clearance rack dress, and finally resting on my face. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. He looked right through me, his brain trying to register who this middle-aged woman was. But then, I reached into my purse, pulled out my worn leather driving gloves, the ones with the tiny, distinct tear on the right index finger, and placed them quietly on the slate table. I watched the exact moment the lightning struck him. The color drained from Julian's face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug at the base of his neck. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes darting from the torn finger of the glove to my face, and then back to the glove. The smug, self-satisfied aura he wore, like a second skin, vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Good morning, Julian," I said. My voice was calm, the same steady, quiet tone I used when I asked him if the temperature in the back of the Traverse was to his liking. "I believe we've had a standing appointment at 6:15 every morning, but today I decided to sit in the back seat." Victoria stopped typing on her tablet, her sharp eyes darting between her son and me. "Julian, what is the meaning of this? Who is this woman?" "Mom," Julian stammered, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to gather the papers on the table. This is Chloe's mother, Darlene." Victoria's eyebrows shot up. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. The driver? The woman who runs the taxi service? Why is she in a private legal signing?" I walked over to Chloe, ignoring Victoria completely. I placed a gentle hand on my daughter's shoulder. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with confusion and fear. "Mom?" she whispered. "What's going on?" "I'm just doing my job, sweetie," I said softly, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'm checking the paperwork." I reached down and picked up the thick document titled General Warranty Deed and Asset Transfer. I turned to the signature page. "Julian, Mr. Waugh." Sterling cleared his throat, his deep voice filled with irritation. "We don't have time for family theatrics. Is the deed being executed or not? The credit committee is waiting on my confirmation to release the partnership bridge loan." "Of course, Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his voice rising in pitch as he glared at me, a desperate, threatening look in his eyes. "Chloe, sign the paper. Now. We'll discuss your mother's issues later." "Don't sign it, Chloe," I said. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low electric hum of the building's ventilation system. "Excuse me?" Victoria stood up, her gold necklaces clinking together. "Who do you think you are? You are a hired driver. You have no standing in this office, and you certainly have no right to interfere in my son's business affairs. Chloe, sign the document. Your grandfather's land is going into a trust for your future. Don't let your mother's jealousy ruin your life." I turned to look at Victoria. I looked her right in her cold, expensive eyes. "My father built the house you live in, Victoria," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper, but it cut through the room like a razor. He was a carpenter. He knew how to measure twice and cut once. And he taught me that when a foundation is rotten, you don't build on it. You tear it down. I turned my gaze back to Julian, who was sweating through his high-end wool suit. "You told your mother that Chloe doesn't know a lien from a loophole," I said, holding his terrified gaze. "You told her that my daughter is naive, that she isn't smart, and that her mother is just a retired office worker who wouldn't notice if you stole her grandfather's land to buy your way into this firm." Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Julian? What is she talking about?" "She's lying, Chloe," Julian shouted, slamming his hand on the slate table. "She's a bitter, jealous woman. She's trying to ruin us because she has nothing. She's been stalking me, driving me to work like some psychopath." "I didn't stalk you, Julian," I interrupted smoothly. "You booked the service. You just never bothered to look at the woman driving you. You were too busy talking on your speakerphone." I nodded to Sarah. She stepped forward, opened the manila folder, and laid 3 certified documents from the Ohio Secretary of State on the slate table, sliding them directly in front of Mr. Sterling. "What is this?" Mr. Sterling asked, his thick eyebrows knitting together as he adjusted his reading glasses. "That," I said, pointing a finger at the top document, "is the active corporate registry for Vance Holdings, LLC. As you can see, the entity was legally registered on Tuesday of this week. The statutory agent is my sister, Sarah Vance. The sole managing member is the Chloe Vance Trust, and I am the sole trustee." Mr. Sterling's face went completely still. He looked at the document, then looked at Julian, his eyes turning cold as stone. "Julian," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "Explain this." I don't know, sir," Julian stammered, his face turning a deep, mottled red. My lawyers filed the paperwork weeks ago. There must be some administrative error. There was an error, Julian, I said, leaning forward, resting my hands on the cold slate table. Your lawyers were sloppy. They tried to register Vance Holdings LLC, but it was rejected due to a name conflict with an active entity in Cleveland. Because you were too arrogant to double-check your own filings, the name reservation expired at midnight on Tuesday. So, I bought it. I looked directly at the senior partner. Mr. Sterling, the deed. Julian is asking my daughter to sign transfers her 3 acres of prime Bath Township land, worth $150,000, to Vance Holdings LLC. But my daughter's fiancé doesn't own that company. He doesn't have a single share, a single vote, or a single legal claim to it. If she signs this deed, the land goes directly into a trust managed by me for her sole benefit. And your firm's bridge loan? It will be secured by an asset owned by an entity that Julian Vance has absolutely no control over. The silence that followed was absolute. Have you ever seen a man's entire future evaporate in a single second? It's not loud. It doesn't make a sound. It's just the look in his eyes when he realizes the ground he thought was solid stone is actually empty air. Mr. Sterling slowly took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He looked at Julian with a mixture of disgust and cold professional detachment. The partnership offer is withdrawn, Julian, Mr. Sterling said quietly, and you have until 12 o'clock to clear your desk. I will not have this firm associated with administrative incompetence, let alone attempted family fraud. Mr. Sterling, please, Victoria cried, her voice cracking with desperation. This is a misunderstanding. We can resolve this. The meeting is over, Victoria, Mr. Sterling said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He looked at me, a faint, respectful nod of his head. Good day, Mrs. Vance. Your father was an excellent carpenter. It seems he taught you well. He walked out of the room, leaving the heavy glass door swinging in his wake. Julian sank back into his leather chair, his face hollow, his eyes staring blankly at the slate table. His perfect, expensive world had just turned to ash, and the only thing left was the smell of his sandalwood cologne, suddenly sour and suffocating in the quiet room. I turned to Chloe. The tears were streaming down her face now, splashing onto the green wool of her sweater. She looked at Julian, then at the thick stack of papers, and finally at me. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She just reached over, picked up the final deed transfer document, and slowly, deliberately ripped it in half. The sound of thick, high-cotton parchment tearing in half is surprisingly loud when a room is completely silent. It sounded like a dry branch snapping in the winter woods. Chloe didn't throw the pieces at Julian. She didn't scream, and she didn't sob. She simply let the 2 halves of the deed slip from her fingers. They drifted down onto the cold slate of the conference table, landing right next to my worn leather driving gloves. For a second, Julian looked like he might try to grab her hand, to spin one last web of beautiful lies. But Sarah stepped between them, her small frame suddenly looking as solid as a brick wall. "Don't you dare touch her," Sarah said, her voice shaking, but her eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire. Victoria stood up so fast, her heavy gold necklaces clattered against each other like cheap wind chimes. "This is absurd," she hissed, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. "Julian, let's go. This family of taxi drivers and clerks is beneath us anyway. They deserve to stay exactly where they are." She grabbed her designer purse and swept out of the room, her high heels clicking a furious, rapid rhythm against the hardwood floor. Julian hesitated for one desperate moment. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was already on his phone, his back turned, completely ignoring his presence. He looked at Chloe, who wouldn't even meet his eye. Finally, he picked up his expensive leather briefcase, the one that was supposed to buy him a seat at the big table, and slunk out the door like a dog that had been caught stealing from the counter. When the heavy glass door finally clicked shut behind him, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't tense anymore. It just felt empty, like a room where a bad draft had finally been shut out. I walked over to Chloe. I didn't care about the high-rise view, the corporate lawyers, or the $99 LLC filing in my purse. I just saw my baby girl. Her shoulders were shaking, and she looked so incredibly small in that oversized leather chair. I reached down and pulled her up into my arms. She buried her face in my shoulder, her tears wetting the collar of my clearance-rack navy dress. I held her tight, rocking her back and forth, just like I used to do when she was a little girl and had scraped her knees on the asphalt of our driveway. "I've got you, baby," I whispered into her hair, which smelled of lavender soap and the cold Cleveland rain. "I've got you. You're safe." We didn't stay in that high-rise a minute longer. We walked out of the Sterling Tower, through the revolving doors, and out into the biting November wind. But as we walked to the parking garage, we weren't running. We walked with our heads up, our boots clicking against the pavement in a steady, proud rhythm. For the first time in months, Chloe didn't slide into the back seat of my Chevy Traverse. She climbed right into the front passenger seat, pulling her knees up to her chest and wrapping her green sweater tightly around herself. I started the engine, and the heater groaned to life, slowly filling the cabin with the familiar, comforting scent of cinnamon and warm vinyl. I reached over and turned the dial, letting the dry warmth blow directly on her hands. As I shifted the car into drive and merged into the highway traffic heading back to Akron, Chloe looked down at the console. Her eyes rested on my driving gloves, the ones with the tiny frayed tear on the right index finger. "You drove him," she said, her voice small and hollow. "Every single morning, Mom? While I was sleeping, you were driving him to work?" I kept my eyes on the wet asphalt of Route 18, my hands steady on the steering wheel. "I had a mortgage to pay, sweetie. And I wanted to make sure you didn't have to worry about helping me. I wanted you to have your dream." A fresh tear rolled down her cheek, but she reached out and placed her soft hand over my gloved one. "He never even looked at you, did he?" "No," I said softly, squeezing her hand. "He never did. But that was his mistake, Chloe. When you look right through the people who keep your world running, you miss the very thing that can bring it down. If you've ever had to watch your child go through the painful process of untangling her life from a liar, you know it doesn't happen overnight." The weeks that followed were quiet, and they were heavy. There were wedding invitations to cancel, caterers to call, and a beautiful white dress sitting in the back of Chloe's closet that had to be boxed up and sent back. But we did it together. Every evening, Sarah would come over to our modest, split-level home. We'd sit at my worn kitchen table, the yellow light from the overhead lamp warming the room. I'd put on the kettle, and we'd drink strong chicory coffee from our chipped ceramic mugs. We didn't talk about Julian. We talked about my father, about the smell of fresh cedar shavings in his workshop, and about how he always said that a house built on sand will always find its way to the sea. As for the Bath Township property, it remained exactly where my father wanted it to be, in Chloe's hands. Using my decades of title experience, I formally dissolved the administrative shell of Vance Holdings, LLC, and transferred the land into a clean, ironclad personal trust. No partner, no husband, and no slick corporate lawyer will ever be able to touch a single blade of grass on those 3 acres without Chloe's written, notarized consent. It is her sanctuary now, her safety net, just like her grandfather intended. A few months later, when the brutal Ohio winter finally began to soften into a wet, green spring, I was sitting at my kitchen table, looking over some local tax assessor maps. The ice on Route 18 had melted, and the first yellow daffodils were starting to push through the damp soil in my front yard. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an email from a generic address. I opened it and saw Julian's name. He didn't write a long letter. He didn't offer a grand apology. He had been hired by a small, low-tier commercial brokerage down in Canton, far away from the glittering high-rises of downtown Cleveland. His leased German sports car was gone, replaced by a sensible 10-year-old Japanese sedan he'd bought at a local lot. The email was short, formal, and written with a stiffness that showed how much it pained him to send it. He asked if I would consider signing a release for the name Vance Holdings, LLC, as his new regional firm wanted to use a similar entity structure, and my active registration was blocking their filings. He offered to pay the $99 filing fee back to me. I sat there for a long time, looking at his name on the screen. The sandalwood cologne was gone. The charcoal wool coat was gone. He was just a young man in Canton, trying to rebuild a life he had ruined with his own arrogance. I felt a sudden, unexpected wave of pity. Not forgiveness, mind you. Forgiveness is a sacred thing that has to be earned with real change, and Julian wasn't there yet. But I didn't feel any malice either. When you finally find your peace, You don't need the people who hurt you to suffer. You just need them to be gone. I typed a brief, professional reply. I told him I would instruct my sister, Sarah, to release the name reservation at the end of the month, free of charge. I didn't ask for his $99. I didn't need his money, and I certainly didn't need his gratitude. I pressed send, closed my laptop, and took a slow, deep breath of the fresh spring air coming through the cracked kitchen window. I know some of you are sitting at your own kitchen tables right now, looking at bills or contracts, or maybe just staring at a phone, wondering how you're going to survive a betrayal from someone who was supposed to protect you. You might feel small. You might feel invisible, like you're just part of the upholstery in your own life. But let me tell you something, from one mother to another. Don't ever underestimate the power of your silence. Don't ever let them make you believe that because you work with your hands, or because you drive a car, or because you press your own clothes, you are powerless. The people who think they own the world are often the ones who are too blind to see the ground shifting right beneath their feet. Your strength doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to wear a designer suit or speak in corporate jargon. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is just keep your eyes on the road, hold your steering wheel steady, and wait for the right turn. Chloe came down the stairs then, wearing her favorite worn flannel shirt, her hair tied back in a loose pony. She smelled of lavender soap and fresh potting soil. She had a small plastic tray of heirloom tomato seedlings in her hands, her eyes bright with the promise of the coming summer. "Ready to go to the land, Mom?" she asked, a genuine, beautiful smile lighting up her face. "I want to map out where the garden is going to go." I picked up my brass magnifying glass from the desk, placed it carefully in my canvas tote bag, and reached for my car keys. "I'm ready, baby," I said, wrapping my arm around her shoulders as we walked out into the warm Ohio sunshine.